My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
And my name is Pixel Patch. I'm a joyful geek with an expertise in gaming, both tabletop and video.
Our mission is to bring nerd culture to the masses.
And by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, TV, mega comic books, or is that graphic novels, cartoons, groups, that's animation, Disney, Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, and Digimon, and Mighty Morphin, Power Rangers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Nintendo, Cinematic Universes, Marvel, DC, Justice League, is Batman, Leagues with Superman, Flash, Wonder Woman, Avengers, Iron Man, Captain Jaws, Loki, Spider-Man, and Hulk and Logan, X-Men, Battlers, Allen, Galaxy, Guardians, Star Trek, Prick, Prick, Card, and Janeway, Nerds and Geeks from Gather Around, and join them in the Big Bad Shark, Average Joe and Pixel Patch, they peek under the microscope.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd culture under the microscope. That awkward silence tells you that Pixel Patch is not here to jump in immediately with some kind of clever joke.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he does that.
But that's okay. We are here this week with our old friend Ben the Movie Buff. So welcome back to the show.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me back. I always have fun on these, so let's do this.
Oh yeah, that's your thing. You always got to...
That's right, yeah. Let's do this. We high-fived.
Yeah, because that's the thing from your YouTube videos. Maybe you want to share anything interesting about what's happening in YouTube land or movie land or IMDb land?
To be completely honest with my YouTube channel, I haven't done that much over the last few months because I have been so busy with work. The film industry is really bouncing in Ottawa, which is really great. But of course, it means less time for making videos. However, I'm hoping to make a video in the next few days and upload it in the next week or so about bad behavior at the movies. Because as you know, people talk during the movie. People sometimes check their phones or kick the back of your seat. And I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Which, of course, is a famous quote from a movie in the 70s, which if you can get what it is. Yep. You got it, Average Joke. You got it. So... yeah, I want to do a video about that because, you know, once in a while you deal with experiences like that. So that's probably going to be my next video. Hopefully it'll come out in the next week or so. I have 89 subscribers currently, so if there's one person who feels like helping me get to that 90, I would appreciate it. But, yeah, I'm going to try and give it a bit more life before a big change comes next month.
I think,
in the form of a baby.
Oh. Well, I think the Bat Jar YouTube channel is subscribed, and I think my personal one is, but if you want, I can use my work Gmail account to subscribe.
There we go. Thanks. That would be so helpful. If you want to, man, I would appreciate it. And if there's anyone else out there listening, then, yeah, that'd be pretty cool.
Have you noticed people at the movies, like, exemplifying bad behavior recently, or is this just something that you've always been passionate about?
When I went to see Us in April, I think it was, which, really good movie. I really enjoyed it. The one thing that killed it, though, was that two different people were on their phones. And a lot of the movie takes place during night, meaning that the theater is pretty dark. It's not like a daytime scene where, you know, the light from the screen is illuminating the auditorium. But it was fairly dark in there. And, yeah, people were on their phones, and they didn't even bother to, like, turn the brightness down. Like, it was the equivalent to having, like, a flashlight out. So, yeah, I think it's still happening. And people need to be reminded once in a while to, you know, not go on their phone, to not talk, to not kick the back of the seat. Unless you're in reclining seating, the back of your seat being kicked is not an issue there, but people still talk and go on their phones, so it must stop.
All right, I look forward to seeing that video because I agree with everything you're saying there.
Thank you. Yep, should be fun.
Speaking of things that are frustrating to talk about, this is a good segue. We're talking about the X-Men franchise today, and particularly their newest film, Dark Phoenix, and we really can't do this movie justice without kind of talking about how we got to this place.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the X-Men franchise generally on the podcast in the past. I was a kid when the first film came out in 2000, and I had grown up watching the 90s X-Men animated series, which was super colorful. Every character had their own unique costume. They had their code names, and it was always just about the X-Men going on adventures.
Look out! The moment you've been waiting for is here.
Get the mutants!
It's the X-Men Explosive season premiere on Fox.
Don't y'all leave now. The fun just started.
There's all new action.
Let's take these sardines out of the can.
All new adventure.
Y'all want to play catch?
All new danger.
I'll destroy all the X-Men.
You've got to see it to believe it.
You're mine.
So watch the X-Men Explosive season premiere this Saturday morning on Fox and...
Watch out, get out of the way!
I was introduced through the movies. I think I saw snippets of the show as a kid, but there were just so many other shows that I was into at the time. And because of, I guess the way, like the TV channels that I had access to as a kid, I don't think we had access to Fox or the channel that was playing the X-Men cartoon. So I'd see it here and there when I went to my grandma's, but I don't know that much about the animated series other than the things I've heard over the past 15, 20 years. But yes, with the movies, it was my girlfriend at the time, actually, who had introduced me to X-Men. So she had me watch the first X-Men movie on VHS, which I liked.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now seeing another stage of human evolution.
This summer, the future is here.
There is a war coming. You sure you're on the right side?
Settle this. Welcome to the future. X-Men.
And then she showed me X2 on DVD, which I liked even more. And then, of course, 2 months later, X-Men: The Last Stand came out, so I got to see that in theaters. So that was my introduction to the X-Men.
Wait. So you didn't know anything about X-Men at all until 2006?
Well, not anything. I knew very little. I knew what the X-Men were. It was kind of like the Avengers. It's like I knew who the Avengers were well before I started getting into the MCU. But really, it wasn't until it's like when I see it in a movie, that's how I tend to be introduced to it. So yeah, I learned more about the X-Men in 2006.
Interesting, because the first X-Men film is very much a product of its time. It came out 3 years after Batman and Robin.
Yep.
At a point when superhero movies were not cool. Like, nobody wanted to be making a superhero movie. That first X-Men film, it takes out all of the comic booky elements, or as much of the comic booky elements as possible. And the director of that film, Bryan Singer, is a sci-fi fan.
Yeah.
And he knew nothing of comic books. He'd never heard of the X-Men before he was kind of looked into this project. Mm-hmm. And what he did, essentially, in crafting his movie is he basically looked at the X-Men, he pulled out all the sci-fi elements that he was attracted to and made the movie about that.
Yeah.
So, the core conflict of the X-Men and the core, I would say, the core of the characters is represented in his movies, but it never goes all the way into superhero comic book fare.
Right.
Which, again, for the time, when that first one came out, was totally the right way to go.
Yeah.
Because that was a way to get mainstream audiences invested in superhero characters. Mm-hmm. By the time you would have watched it for the first time in 2006, there had been a whole bunch of other superhero movies.
That's right, yeah.
So did it feel too laid back or too scaled back, or was it still okay?
No, I think it was still fine. I think what spoke to me the most, on top of just this really cool idea about what if you had people that had these different powers and how would society view them and all that, I liked how political it got. I liked that it kind of started with the fact that they had this Mutant Registration Act, and that you have all these politicians that are scared, and we see how the mutants kind of react to that. There's a line, I think, from the beginning where one of the I guess it's the senator, right? The senator character from the beginning, who says something along the lines of a kid that can walk through walls, what's to stop them from walking walking into the White House or walking into a bank to steal money from a bank, right? So they really set up what this world, how this world is feeling about mutants and all the politics that surround it. So I thought that was a cool angle to come in from, because at that time, yes, I would have seen both Spider-Man movies. I would have seen Batman Begins. But of course, those movies I definitely kind of have their own style and focus a bit more on the spectacle of being a superhero and whatnot. Maybe Spider-Man more so than Batman Begins. But I like that X-Men kind of it was grounded in the politics of what would it be like if mutants actually lived in this world, and I thought that was a cool introduction to get us into those movies.
Yeah, there's a line of dialogue from Wolverine in the first film where they're they're going out in their black leather suits.
Yeah.
You actually go outside in these things?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Of course, is a jab at comic books.
That's right.
And
the
fact that Wolverine's comic book costumes are frequently yellow.
Yeah, that's right. A little wink, wink, nudge, nudge, audience.
But that line for me kind of just captures the tone those movies have. It's okay, we're gonna take all the kid silly stuff out of this and just find the parts of it that are actually good.
Yeah.
And therefore that'll be the basis for our film. Which obviously worked because, like you said, the first two movies were received well, both by audiences and critics.
Yep.
And this was, again, Fox 20th Century Fox doing these movies. They had bought the rights to X-Men in the 90s, and before the MCU was really a thing, they were developing X-Men movies.
That's right. Yep.
Where does that take us to here? Because basically, the story with this episode of what we're talking about begins in 2006 with X-Men: The Last Stand, because the director of the movie we saw this weekend was a writer on X-Men: The Last Stand.
Yep.
And at the time, it was called X-Men: The Last Stand because it was supposed to be the last X-Men movie.
Yeah.
Like, they were finishing their trilogy and they thought they were done. So if you watch X-Men: The Last Stand, and you said you just watched it yesterday,
Yeah.
It really does end everything, doesn't it? It acts as a conclusion to the story.
Yeah, it's interesting. It does a bit of both, in my opinion. On the one hand, yes, it feels like there are certain things that it puts a cap on, right? That you feel like this is the, kind of a proper ending. Even if it's not an amazing ending, it still feels like an ending. But then, of course, the last scene that you see before they cut to credits, of course, is a little like one of those, it feels like in the style of the MCU kind of post-credit, mid-credit scenes where it feels like it's adding something more. So like there's the quick scene with Magneto and the chess piece at the end of X-Men: The Last Stand. But then I'm pretty sure there's also another post-credit scene dealing with Xavier that also feels like we're not really completely done here yet, are we? but the ending overall to the movie does feel like it's ending, but then it's those two scenes that feel like, but wait, there's more.
Now, that movie is pretty much hated by a lot of comic book fans, comic book movie fans, and just movie fans in general.
Yep.
I don't remember it being very good, but I don't remember it being terrible.
Yeah.
Upon revisiting it, does it still sting?
You know what? A little bit, but and I guess we'll get into more detail about this later on, but after seeing Dark Phoenix last night and kind of revisiting X-Men: The Last Stand, I think I might actually like The Last Stand slightly more than I did before. Not a good movie by any means. It has its problems, but it's not a terrible movie.
So, the X-Men series, even though they did The Last Stand, they continued on, and the way they thought they would continue on is by going to the past. So they started developing a bunch of prequels. They did X-Men Origins Wolverine, which less said about that, the better.
Yeah.
And they were developing another film called X-Men Origins Magneto, and getting into his origins and his character. And that ended up evolving into what became known as X-Men First Class.
That's right, yeah.
And that movie, when it came out, introduced a lot of, we'll call them plot holes, inconsistencies with the timeline.
Right, yeah.
Characters meeting each other that you wouldn't even, if based on their experience of the original trilogy, you wouldn't know that they knew each other.
Right.
So people started to get confused, saying, like, is this movie meant to be a reboot? Because there's just so many elements that are different from before that it just doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Almost to say as if the writers don't care. And by 2011, the MCU was in full steam, kind of building up towards the Avengers. So
that's right, yeah.
When First Class did well with the critics and people liked it, Fox had to try and figure out a way to keep this train going.
Right.
Because if they stopped making movies, the rights would go back to Marvel.
Right, yeah.
So they had to find a way to keep it going. And that led us to Days of Future Past in 2014. And that movie did the excellent job of kind of merging the prequel cast with the cast of the original movies and doing a time travel story that allowed them to kind of just really reset the clock. The way Days of Future Past ends, it kind of gives you like a happy ending for all the original cast of X-Men.
Yep.
And then it allows them to sort of continue on telling whatever stories they wanted. Do you remember seeing Days of Future Past? Do you remember enjoying it?
Oh, yeah. No, I revisited that briefly last night as well. Because I just thought like I want to check this out too, because I also wanted to see like the new ending that they came up with for the cast of the original, and it might be my favorite X-Men movie. For a while it was X2, and I also really like First Class, but it might be Days of Future Past just because it has such a harder task of you have the old X-Men, you have the new X-Men, we're putting them together. And yes, even though a lot of people say that what happens in the end is a little controversial because they say, well, if the whole timeline is reset, that means it changes things drastically for the earlier movies. But in a way, I see what they were trying to do, and I think they succeeded quite well at it. And really, like Quicksilver's scene in the movie, it's just like one of the best scenes in a comic book movie, period.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Days of Future Past is probably one of my favorite X-Men movies. However, it introduces a lot of elements that really just start to weigh down the X-Men films. And you can still see the imprint of these things in Dark Phoenix.
Right.
So for one thing, it introduces the idea of skipping ahead to a different decade.
Yeah, that's right.
Because First Class was set in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then the main events of Days of Future Past are in the 1970s.
Yeah, 1973, I think.
And so inexplicably, all the cast is somehow 10 years older, and they don't really look a day older.
Yep, they've all aged quite well in the X-Men universe.
Jennifer Lawrence, who, when she appeared in X-Men First Class as Mystique before she was in the Hunger Games, before she was kind of the big star.
That's right, yep.
So by the time Days of Future Past comes around, she's the biggest celebrity in the world in a sense.
Yep.
So in order for her to kind of be highlighted, they wrote the story for Days of Future Past in a way that highlighted Mystique and gave Jennifer Lawrence more screen time.
Yep.
Addition to that, because she had the star power and the bargaining power, she found ways to make sure that she was out of the blue makeup.
Right, of course, yeah.
So, if you look at Rebecca Romijn, who played Mystique in the original films, you never see her as Rebecca Romijn. You see her once in X2.
And then also briefly in The Last Stand.
Yes.
You do, yeah.
But generally, she's either blue or she's dressed up as somebody else.
Yep.
In Days of Future Past, First Class, Apocalypse, and Dark Phoenix, there's a lot of Jennifer Lawrence looking like Jennifer Lawrence.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the focus on Jennifer Lawrence's character is something that was really highlighted in Days of Future Past that sort of continues on into the other films. Then this brings us to X-Men Apocalypse. And this is the film that came out 3 years ago now. They could have done anything with this movie because they literally had it's like they had a wide open field in front of them. Because they had reset the timeline, they were no longer kind of restricted or having to work around what was established in the original trilogy.
Yep.
They had total freedom to go wherever they wanted. And yet they still somehow, in the way they wrote the film, still somehow created inconsistencies and plot holes from the previous two films in their like little franchise.
Yeah.
And then the end result was something that was disappointing both critically and commercially. And we talked about these movies earlier on in the podcast history, referring to how, they brought Bryan Singer back for first Days of Future Past and then for X-Men Apocalypse.
Right.
Saying, well, the original director left after X-Men 2, so that's why they started getting bad, because the guy who was the shepherd of the Vision was gone.
Right.
And then Days of Future Past showed, see, you bring him back, things go well.
Yeah.
But then X-Men Apocalypse, it shows you that, no, it doesn't necessarily have, this guy can still do bad movies.
Yeah. It's possible.
And all the two comments I made about Days of Future Past with Mystique and then the timeline being confusing and being inconsistent, those are just sort of exacerbated in X-Men Apocalypse.
Right.
And I do remember being like kind of off-put by those during my viewing of the movie, but I was still able to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then it was only really in the time after the movie came out that I started thinking more about it. I'm like, yeah, that was underwhelming or that was unimpressive. And
yeah, no, I agree. I think after I saw Apocalypse, like while I enjoyed it, it definitely felt like a step down from Days of Future Past. And then, of course, Logan comes out the following year, and it's like, well, it's obviously hard to go up against that. But Apocalypse, yeah, definitely felt like a bit of a step down. It had its own highlights for sure, but when you get used to seeing a movie as good as Days of Future Past, and then you get to Apocalypse, yeah, you can't help but feel like you've kind of taken a step back in quality.
People might say, oh, you're being too nitpicky, or, oh, you shouldn't have to worry about it being connected to a bunch of other stuff, like timeline, continuity, whatever, just enjoy it as a movie. But the thing is, this movie, Apocalypse, came out like a month after Civil War.
That's right, yeah.
And Civil War is a movie built on not just telling a great story, but having great characters and somehow tying in storylines from several different films.
So much, yeah. It's unbelievable what they do in that movie. But they pulled it off.
So it's like, obviously, it can happen, and this just becomes an example of how not to do that very thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Apocalypse sort of ended the trilogy, if you will, of we'll call them the prequels.
Right.
Because it's basically, that's what they're originally intended to be, are prequels to the original movies. But you know what? MCU is still trucking along, so they have to keep making X-Men films. So they started developing more spin-offs, which is how we got things like Logan and Deadpool.
Yeah.
But there was still chatter of doing an actual continuation of X-Men, because Apocalypse, for all its flaws, does introduce like a younger version of a lot of the X-Men.
That's right, yeah.
And you could totally see them. It's like, okay, we're starting over with a new crew of X-Men, and because we changed the timeline, we can go wherever with these people. So it was announced in March of 2017, right when Logan was coming out, that they were starting to work on the next X-Men film, and that it was going to come out in November 2018. That was the original release date set for Dark Phoenix.
Yep.
So you guys are realizing as we're talking about it now in June 2019 that release date changed not once but twice.
Yeah.
The first time they changed the release date had something to do with the fact that they did test screenings and they weren't received well, the test screenings. So they wanted to schedule reshoots to reshoot stuff that would make it more interesting, I suppose, or that it would answer some of the fan complaints.
Yeah.
But because the cast of this film is so popular, we'll say, they weren't going to be able to get everyone back together again until after the November 2018 release date.
Right.
So the film's release date was pushed up till February 2019, and the reshoots were announced and scheduled. Now, generally, reshoots, in my mind, are a bad thing because it shows that the movie, they couldn't get it right when they shot it the first time. But for somebody who's a little more invested in the film industry than me, are reshoots really that bad a thing?
It really depends, right? When I was watching, on a side note, when I was watching the bonus material for The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, so on average, they might do like a few weeks of reshoots for, just like, oh, this scene could have been better, we need to change this or that. The Hobbit Part 3 had 50 days of reshoots. And to put that into perspective, I work on made-for-TV movies that are on average shot between 14 to 16 days. So for a big movie to have 50 days of reshoots, I feel like it can kind of be indicative of the fact that they don't have all their ducks in a row, that there's still some stuff that has to happen. I think reshoots can be a positive thing, but I feel like that all depends on the production and what they're reshooting. Because I feel like sometimes, it means that they didn't get it all right during filming. But when I think about the complexities of the work that I do on made-for-TV movies over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, then I try and imagine multiplying that time and time again to a big movie like an X-Men movie. And yes, it can get kind of complicated. And remember, we're all people, right? We're not perfect beings that are like, we know how to make the perfect movie, let's do it now. Like, we make mistakes along the way. We have a gut feeling like, let's try this could work, we'll see what happens here. And then they get to a test screening and they're like, oh shoot, maybe we did take a few missteps, let's do some reshoots. So I think it depends on the movie, but yes, sometimes I think that normally means that we can't salvage the movie from what we currently have. We need to film more in order to try and make it better.
Because for me, Justice League is kind of like the most prominent example of a movie that had reshoots.
True.
And in that case, the reshoots are obvious because you can sort of tell that because it was done by a different director, you can see the different tone.
That's right, yep.
But, okay, on the whole, reshoots aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Sometimes you need them, and sometimes you might be able to live without them. But really, those big movies, they are so big that a reshoot might mean the difference between delivering a disaster and delivering an okay movie.
And then, whatever, they changed the release date to February, and then I remember this past September, they released the trailer that at the end of the trailer announced the February release date. And then the next day, they changed the release date again to June. And they clearly don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
If the day after you release your trailer, you then change the release date again.
Yep.
Now, granted, by September 2018, to give them some credit, the Disney Fox acquisition stuff was kind of coming towards the latter end of its life.
Right, yeah.
And it was unclear what was going to be happening with Fox films that had already been produced and had already been shot. So perhaps they just kept pushing the release date because they were encountering problems in post-production or something. I don't know. But with movies like this, it's always kind of concerning to see the release date change a couple times.
Yeah.
Because it tells me that, they don't know what they're doing. Or that they're having a hard time getting what they want done.
Yeah, it's that. And I would also comment by saying it's also just reflective of the fact that, I kind of came up with this quote. I'm sure other people have said a similar thing too. But to me, it seems like film is changing all the time, right? No matter what film you work on, no matter what film you're observing, like X-Men Dark Phoenix, film is changing all the time because especially these bigger movies, I imagine if people just out of curiosity worked on one of these movies for a few months to get a sense of like the enormity, the size of like all the moving parts, all the all the hours that are put into making a movie like this, I think it does go to show that yes, they might not know what they're doing, but they might also be trying to salvage, trying to fix problems as they go along, right? They say, 90% of making films is problem solving. is, this problem we didn't anticipate, and now this thing's going to happen, and what happens if we lose our main cast member? Like, how do we move forward? How do we do? So ultimately, at the end of the day, it might just be them trying to make things work despite all the problems that they've had. And it just goes to show that, film changes all the time. And never, if you're to ask a producer, I want you to make a film like this, set on this day with these people. Can you do it? Even if they're like, oh yeah, for sure we can do it. They're just, talking big, right? They don't know for sure that all the stuff that they need to do will always work out the way they expect it to. So many things can change. So many things can evolve.
I think it could have benefited Dark Phoenix a lot if it had actually come out in its original November 2018 release date.
Yeah.
Because at that point, the Disney Fox acquisition was not finalized. Mm-hmm. So there was more ambiguity around what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. Because as it is right now, people, the deal was finalized in March 2019. So everyone going to see this movie basically knows, yep, so this franchise is dead now.
Yeah.
They're going to be folded into the MCU, and we'll never see this version of these characters again.
Right.
So if this had come out back in November, that deal wasn't necessarily finalized yet. It might have, at that point, it could have been shot down by some government regulator. So there would have been more ambiguity about the future of the franchise. Mm-hmm. And then 2, November 2018, there was no other comic book film coming out.
That's right.
That Venom had come out in October.
That's right.
And then we got both Aquaman and Spider-Verse in December.
Yeah.
But there really weren't any big movies that came out. Like there was Bohemian Rhapsody and Nutcracker.
yeah, Nutcracker. Oh,
so
my goodness.
I think just it would have done better at that time if it had come out, because it wouldn't have had as much competition. Because now you have Aladdin, Godzilla, Rocket Man. You have a lot of big movies that it's having to compete with for attention.
Yep.
And it's coming out the same weekend as the Secret Life of Pets sequel.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is obviously going to draw a lot of people away from X-Men.
Absolutely.
But also, if it had come out in November, it would have come out before Captain Marvel and would have come out before Avengers Endgame.
That's right, yep.
Because now everyone is looking at Dark Phoenix through the lens of, it's the final chapter of this saga, of this X-Men, Fox X-Men saga. And now you can't help but compare it to Avengers Endgame, because Avengers Endgame is the end to a story.
That's right.
And it was an end of a story that was done very well. So naturally, you put this up against that.
Yeah.
It doesn't compare. And then Captain Marvel, they're both set in the 90s. They both feature a female character who has a power they don't really understand and can't control.
Yeah.
So there's just parallels to that film that are unfortunately there. Mm-hmm. And again, the layperson, if you're just a person who goes sees these movies, you go see Captain Marvel, and now you go see this, you're like, they just ripped off Captain Marvel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it's like if Dark Phoenix had come out when it was supposed to come out originally, forget whatever those test screen people said.
Yeah.
It would have had. I feel like it would have been received a lot better than it has.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think yes, X-Men movies typically come out during the summer, but you also had Logan coming out in March, I'm pretty sure, and clearly that a lot of people went to go see that. So I think it goes to show that even with the MCU, they've had summer releases. Black Panther came out in February, Thor Ragnarok came out in November, Captain Marvel comes out in March. Yeah. So it just seems to me that with these movies, whatever time you put it at, people are going to come see it. And I think it's, quite possible that the movie might have been slightly more successful, because judging from what it's probably going to make on its opening weekend and then overall give it a few months, I predict along with Screen Junkies about the top 10 summer box office movies, which ones are going to be in the top 10. And Dark Phoenix, I don't see it cracking the top 10, especially with John Wick Chapter 3 doing as well as it is currently. I don't think Dark Phoenix, it's going to be 13 or 14, but it's not going to crack the top 10. And I think it's that sense of, you see the numbers that X-Men Apocalypse had, it's not promising that Dark Phoenix is going to do better.
Yeah, so we usually have Pixel Patch guess what the percentages are on Rotten Tomatoes, but you're probably the type of person who actually looks at those numbers. So
yeah, I've already seen the number. I already know what it is.
So do you remember what the tomato meter was when you saw it last?
Last I saw it was 22%.
Yeah, so right now it's sitting at 23%.
Oh, wow.
And when that came out earlier in the week, I actually got excited. I'm like, oh boy, I can't wait to go watch this movie. Because sometimes it's fun to go watch a movie that is actually bad. But truth be told, when I actually sat down to watch it, I was like, I'm just waiting. Okay, when does it get really bad? Because that's how I felt about Glass. Glass had a really bad tomato meter score,
right, yeah.
and I was like, oh, in Glass, I reached a point. I'm like, okay, this is why it's getting bad reviews.
Yeah.
But with this, in the theater experience, I couldn't see why it was being trashed so bad by the critics. It's been in the time since I watched the movie that I've like started to, as I've marinated with it,
Right.
I'm starting to see, oh yeah, because my overall experience watching it was fine.
Me too.
The audience score is 65%.
Yeah. Funny how that works, huh? The tomato meter is just so low, but audiences are like, I liked it. Or at least some people at least thought it was passable.
Yeah, and if I think about like Aladdin, that movie had like 50-something% from the critics, but then 90-something% from the audiences. So
yeah.
And Godzilla was something similar. Critics were like 40-something, audiences like 60 or 70%. So
Greatest Showman was another example with like a very low, like just barely, I think it was like in the 50% range, but then audiences, there was like 85% of audiences liked it.
But still, this is only 65%. Like in some, that's like a C.
Right.
So it's not like audiences loved the thing.
Yeah.
It got a B- from Cinema Score. So that's not great either.
Yeah.
And going into the weekend, Box Office Mojo was predicting that it would indeed finish in second place behind Secret Life of Pets.
Yeah.
Which is just sad to think about, that we live in a world where the final numbers aren't in yet because it's still, it's Sunday morning where we are.
That's right.
But based on the Friday estimates, they're suggesting the movie will probably make around $35 million.
Yeah.
Which would make it probably the lowest opening for any X-Men movie.
Oh, that is, and that's such a low number. Like for an X-Men movie, for a superhero movie, a blockbuster, let alone $35 million.
A movie that apparently cost $200 million to make.
Because think about like the production budget and then money for the reshoots and the marketing. Like they're not cheap to make.
So this is not good.
Nope.
And we're gonna get into why it's not good, but.
Now, I know that some of you choose to call us superheroes. We're X-Men. It's what we do.
Their greatest enemy.
She's changing.
She'll kill us all. Will come from within. On June 7th,
We're the only chance you have.
the Phoenix will rise.
I've never seen a power like this.
What did I tell you?
X-Men Dark Phoenix. Rated PG-13. June 7th.
In the beginning of the movie, the X-Men seem to be appreciated and liked by most of society, so they're in a good place. But then during a rescue mission, Jean Grey is put in this dangerous situation where she has what is quote-unquote called a solar flare that she absorbs, basically. And because of that, she starts acting differently, she starts feeling differently, and she basically becomes the Dark Phoenix. So it's her trying to figure out what's going on with herself as she's feeling this anger and this rage. And then also you have the X-Men that are trying to save her, that are trying to help her. And all the while, you have these new mysterious characters that are very interested in Jean Grey. And of course, we see throughout the movie why they want a part of her in a way. So that's basically what it's about.
The trailer basically gives away the whole movie.
It does give away a lot. Yeah, I was trying to, and I mean, like, I saw the one trailer that they said, full of spoilers. To be honest, I can't even remember it that much. But given what I saw from the movie last night, that's the setup, right? That's the setup for the first half hour, and then whatever happens after that, got to check out the movie, I'm afraid, or go to spoilers on Wikipedia. But if you like X-Men, I would say you should check it out.
Yeah. So when the trailer came out for this movie, the one that spoils everything, I was so disappointed because, like a lot of people, I was excited when I heard, they're going to do the Dark Phoenix again. They're going to do it right.
Yeah.
Because the way they did Phoenix in X-Men The Last Stand is really as if it's just a multiple personality kind of situation with Jean.
Yeah.
In the comic books, the Phoenix Force is like this alien entity of energy that basically goes into her body and kind of takes her over. Mm-hmm. But in the spirit of those original X-Men films that like dial back all the crazy comic book stuff,
right? Yeah,
let's just make it as like evocative of that in some way, so they kind of made it so it was an extension of her mutant abilities.
Yep.
And no one liked that. And it involved, like, that version of the story involved like Xavier and Magneto with her when she was younger and whatever. And so like the trailer for Dark Phoenix shows similar elements, and you're like, really? Like, they're doing this again?
Yeah.
And it was unclear. It's like, okay, please tell me they're not just, because X-Men Apocalypse kind of teases this as well, as if the Phoenix is supposed to be something inside of Jean.
That's right, yeah.
And they kind of forgot all about that.
That's right. They decided to retcon that and move forward.
So I was immediately, even after seeing the trailer, I was like, oh gosh, this is not going to be good. Mm-hmm. But like I said, when I was actually watching the movie, I was just waiting for like the moment. I was like, okay, where's the part where just dovetails into terrible filmmaking, and like, why has it got 23%? I was really trying to like figure that out.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because the music from Hans Zimmer was so good, like it just sort of elevated everything else.
That's right. It feels very Hans Zimmer-esque. It really does.
Or maybe it was just because like I was just, invested, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't nearly as bad as I was expecting it to be. But at this point, this is like the 7th core X-Men film. It's the 12th in their franchise.
Yeah, that's right, huh? Wow, 12.
The mistakes they make here are acceptable maybe if this was like your first or second film.
Yeah.
But this is like your 12th or your 7th. Like, when are you guys going to learn your mistakes? And this is where we bring up the director of this film, Simon Kinberg. Mm-hmm. This is his first ever director experience, his directorial debut.
Yep.
He's done a lot of writing. He's done a lot of producing. He co-wrote X-Men: The Last Stand, so he was involved with the version of the Phoenix story.
The first attempt
that wasn't received well. So interesting, they kept him around. Mm-hmm. But he also wrote the script for Days of Future Past.
That's right.
He wrote the screenplay and was a contributor to the story. So and then he wrote and produced the Fantastic Four reboot.
Yes, that's
which
right.
we all know is awful.
Yep.
And then he wrote and produced X-Men Apocalypse, which we've discussed is not very good.
Yeah.
He was a producer on X-Men First Class, so he was involved with that movie. Mm-hmm. He's basically been a part of the X-Men films since 2006.
Yeah, for a long time.
But this is now his writer and director debut, so this is very much his vision. I would question giving this guy the keys.
Yes.
He's done enough good and bad to suggest that he might not be the best person for the job. Mm-hmm. He's like the closest the Fox has to like a Kevin Feige of of a figurehead who is kind of leading the charge.
Okay.
Because he's been a producer on Logan, like all the X-Men movies that have come out in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And he's written a bunch of them, and not all of them are good.
Yeah.
So I got to ask you, as a person, again, who knows more about this than me, could you tell this was someone's first time directing?
Yes. I mean, to be honest, you kind of go into it knowing that this is his directorial debut. But it seems to me, even gifted directors, even someone like Quentin Tarantino, for example. Now, to be fair, actually, maybe he's not a great example because, when you see Reservoir Dogs and then you watch all of his other movies and you go back to Reservoir Dogs, you're like, this is so, he has his stamp on all of it, right? So some directors are auteurs, right? When you're watching a Wes Anderson movie, for example, or a Peter Jackson movie, but then you have other directors that, they kind of, they'll do different films here and there, and it feels less like they're an auteur and more like they're just working with the producers to try and make a movie that they want to make. So yes, it was pretty obvious that it was directed by someone who'd never directed before. And my thought, one of the things that really stuck with me in the movie last night was that, not to say the movie was bad, but the movie felt very standard, right? There are so many blockbusters that have come out for such a long time that it's interesting how some blockbusters, you see the stamp of that person, right? Someone like Sam Raimi, when you watch Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2, yes, they're blockbusters, but you also can, if you know the past of Sam Raimi and his influence on he loves the Three Stooges, but he also loves horror. He loves kind of the grotesque and whatnot. You kind of see how that makes its way here and there throughout Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2. But then something like Dark Phoenix, it just very much feels like a director who, I mean, yes, maybe his vision was there somewhere, but it also seems like someone who he was kind of, working with the producers, and they all agreed, we want this kind of movie. Simon, can you make that kind of movie? Yeah, I can, right? I doubt that they said, Simon, we give you complete creative control. I bet you they didn't pull an Orson Welles, and they're literally, do whatever you want with this movie. Make it your own. I imagine there was probably some talk about the producers saying, we want the movie to be like this, not like that, and Simon had to kind of work with that in order to make it. The only thing that I felt might be more Simon and less of the standard X-Men movies was the fact that I was looking at Simon Kinberg's kind of filmography of the movies he's produced and either created, shows that he's created or things that he's written, and you do see an influence of sci-fi there. And yes, one could argue that a lot of the X-Men movies are sci-fi because of, I guess just the science and the superpowers and whatnot, but Dark Phoenix, in a way, kind of takes that sci-fi one step further because of those mysterious characters. That, like, I don't know, like, is it a spoiler to say what they are?
Yeah, I would say let's leave some mystery here.
So, but you see that Simon Kinberg, like, you know, like he did the was part of the Fantastic Four reboot, which like definitely has like a sci-fi essence. He was one of the creators of the Twilight Zone reboot as well, which also is very much rooted in sci-fi. So you get the sense that they took the sci-fi one step further with this movie, really. So if someone were to ask me, like, oh, what is Simon Kinberg's stamp on this movie, I would say, I think it's the science fiction that's taken one step further. But beyond that, the movie feels pretty standard.
Okay, so it boggles my mind that this guy, again, like, has had these many opportunities to like come back to you know, he's getting second chances. That doesn't happen very often in Hollywood.
That's right.
You get a second
really
chance
doesn't.
at telling the same story.
Yeah.
And you know, like part of my annoyance of this film is that it continues these trends from the previous film. So it jumps ahead another decade to the early 90s. Yeah. I didn't feel like once that it was actually like, it didn't matter to me that it was in the 90s.
Yep.
It's like, if you're gonna make a film a period piece, make it matter. Like none of the clothing or the maybe the cars, but nothing really.
Right.
Like Captain Marvel didn't really feel like really like a 90s movie either, but I feel like there was more effort put there to make it like set in the 90s than this film.
Yes, and of course they have a quick scene, and you see this in the trailer, so it's not a huge spoiler, but like we see Blockbuster.
Right.
So there's an obvious like, hey, it's the 90s where Blockbuster was a big thing.
And with that creates more inconsistencies, because if I'm supposed to just turn off my brain and forget about continuity, and just say, well, just imagine the last film in this one.
Yeah.
Even from X-Men Apocalypse, there are continuity errors that are established in Dark Phoenix. So it's like, I can't just go off of the last film because that one doesn't make sense anymore.
Yep.
And they intentionally refer to X-Men First Class in this film. And it's like, okay, you're reminding me of the fact that in 1963, Nicholas Hoult looks like Nicholas Hoult.
Yeah.
And somehow in 1992, almost 30 years later, he looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
You can't do that to me. You can't have the film be that inconsistent with its characterization, but then like say, oh, like we're writing this because as if we don't care about the continuity,
right?
But then you intentionally draw back into the continuity. You know, it just doesn't. You can't go both ways. Either you actually put the effort in to tell a story that fits in the continuity, or you ignore the continuity altogether.
Yeah, they seem to be very loosey-goosey with just the way that like characters have either aged, or like the whole like, oh, well, they wouldn't age for this reason or they wouldn't age for that reason. It's like, okay, but even at the end of the day, like, you know, Eric Lenscher and Charles Xavier, they should have aged somewhat, right? I mean, they have powers, but that doesn't mean it's like Lord of the Rings and it's like you can look like you're 40 years old, but really you're 90. It's like they should age like normal humans, like, right?
Mystique makes sense because she has the shape-shifting going on. But yeah, Xavier and Magneto, they hardly look any older than they did in First Class.
Yeah.
So it's
very loosey-goosey with the timeline and like who's how old, and you know, it's almost they're like, don't worry about that, just focus on the present. But like you say, they keep on doing callbacks to earlier movies, and it's like, I can't focus on the present if you're reminding me of the past.
I realize that Dark Phoenix kind of is a sequel to Apocalypse because it has all of the young X-Men from Apocalypse, but I feel like this film works better as if it was just a sequel to Days of Future Past, because if you were to if you cut out Apocalypse, a lot of the inconsistencies and plot holes that are in this film wouldn't matter if Apocalypse didn't exist.
Right. Okay.
And we'll get into that in spoilers to say like there are really big things that just you go, what?
Yep.
So if you were to imagine that Apocalypse didn't happen and this just happened to be the first film that came out after Days of Future Past, it would work fine because, you would be wondering who these characters are, but at the very least, you wouldn't have as many of the inconsistencies as there are.
Right.
This is not a fault of this film in particular, but it's a fault I have with all these prequel, I guess you would call them, X-Men movies.
Yeah.
They do Beast injustice because the whole point of his character is that he's stuck as a blue furry guy because he tried to cure his mutation and it failed.
Right.
They've written in this stupid thing where he has this serum that can turn him back in Nicholas Hoult.
Yeah.
It's you're completely betraying the intention of this character by having him having the actor an excuse to not wear the makeup.
Yep.
And he's in the makeup enough in this movie. It's like, does it really matter for him to be in those couple scenes looking like regular Nicholas Hoult?
Yeah.
But I care about that because I'm an X-Men fan. Does that bother you at all?
Well, the more you talk about it, like, it makes sense. Like, does it bother me? Not really, but I can understand why that would be an issue. And yeah, it's interesting how I feel like sometimes things get more interesting when it's either one way or the other, right? But yeah, like, it seems like now they have opportunities where they can kind of just go in the middle ground and have him looking like a human. But I get that because, like you're saying, with him trying to use the serum to cure himself, it makes sense that would backfire on him to the point where he can't change out of his beast form. And it's like, now that's a permanent repercussion that he has to live with for the rest of his life. I find that more dramatic and more interesting than, like, well, going back to Nicholas Holtz, I guess things are okay because I can just switch back and forth. So I hear you.
Jennifer Lawrence is not Mystique. Like, this character that she's playing in these movies is not Mystique. They did a good job in First Class of kind of like showing how she would go towards the path of being a villain.
Yeah.
But then after Jennifer Lawrence became a big superhero, or not superhero, but superstar,
yeah,
they've intentionally written that character so that it's more of a, not just a heroic character, but a main character. Mystique works best as like a villain who is constantly shape-shifting and looking like different people, not looking like Jennifer Lawrence.
Right, yeah, but of course she looks like Jennifer Lawrence a lot of the time.
And the whole message of at First Class was mutant and proud, right? To accept her true form. And she spends all her time looking like Jennifer Lawrence. That's right. Because Jennifer Lawrence doesn't want to sit in the makeup chair for 7 hours. Which is, I understand, but you know what? It's like, if you're going to play this part and do it justice, that's part of the gig.
Yeah, you're getting around $10 million for playing that character, so I think she'd be okay if she just, kind of, stayed in the makeup chair.
Now, granted, like the complaints I have about Mystique and Beast, those are not fault of Dark Phoenix alone. They're just continuations of things that have been in the, been a part of these newer X-Men films. But the fact that they're still doing, it's still there. It's just like, it's like ripping a Band-Aid off a wound that just hasn't had time to heal.
And I don't think it's any mistake that the way we see Mystique in Dark Phoenix, that she's wearing the suit, so you only see her face, but you don't see, like, she's wearing a suit the whole time. It's like, I bet you that took an hour in makeup, so I bet you that was easier on her.
And the makeup doesn't even look as
that's
intricate
right.
as it used to.
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of that. I didn't like the look of it.
Okay, I'm gonna try and. All right, talk about something good with this movie.
Yep.
Sophie Turner, who plays Jean Grey. I do not watch Game of Thrones, but I understand that she's like one of the main characters on Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah.
And I can see that she's a very talented actress, because she does an excellent job in this movie.
Yep.
Like, her performance is like one of the things that kind of carries you through. And that's the thing. Like, none of the actors in this, I would say, are doing a bad job. Like, they're all really good actors.
Yeah.
And they're doing the best with what they're given.
Absolutely.
But Sophie Turner especially, you can sense just from the looks in her eye, like the fear and the frustration and the anger and the confusion. Like, you really, I don't know, go on that journey with her.
Yeah, in revisiting X-Men: The Last Stand, the way they do Dark Phoenix with that performance and that character, it is interesting that, I think this time around that they focused a bit more on, just the fear and just being scared about like what's going on, and I think she taps into that quite well. If there is one thing the movie gets right, is that the performances are all good. I really don't think there's one performance that I thought like, no, I'm sorry, you're just not quite there. Because really, like, think about it. I mean, Jennifer Lawrence, I guess, is kind of debatable, but like, you still have her. You have Nicholas Hoult, who we've seen a number of times be really good. Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, Sophie Turner. Like, you have quite the cast. Like Jessica Chastain. I mean, once again, we'll get to that in more detail later, but you still have quite a good cast that's coming together to try their best with what they're given.
A lot of the X-Men in this movie are just there.
Yeah.
Like, they don't have a character arc. They don't really have, you don't really get to know much about them. They're just there, and they use their powers in action scenes.
Yep.
Which is frustrating, because like, I like this version of Storm. I like this version of Nightcrawler. I like this version of Quicksilver. I like this version of Cyclops. Like, they look the part, and like they look cool using their powers, but I never really learned much more about who they are, or they don't even really go through a journey in the movie. They're just sort of there.
Right. I was trying to remember, I watched X-Men Apocalypse a few years ago, shortly after it came out, and I only saw it the one time. But Dark Phoenix was kind of making me wonder, because, like you say, there are a lot of characters that, like, they're just there. And I was trying to think. I was like, all right, so let's see. How are they introduced in X-Men Apocalypse, and like what did they do in that movie? And I'm having a hard time remembering. And I wonder if part of it is because they didn't do much. So that's why I'm forgetting. It's because they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything memorable. Even like you could argue in Storm in the first X-Men, even though she might not have had a massive amount to do, I felt like she still had a bit more to do. And that whole like the whole line about like what happens when a toad hits lightning, the same thing that happens to everything else. As awful as the line is, at least it's memorable, right? At least like I can still think about like some of the scenes that I remember Storm in the first X-Men movie that I haven't seen in years. Yet X-Men Apocalypse, I'm struggling to remember, like, what did these characters do? Like, they were there for a few scenes. They took part in the action scenes. But, yeah, did they have an arc? Did they have any scene where we really got, like, I absolutely love Nightcrawler in X2 because you get that awesome opening scene with Nightcrawler, and then you get the X-Men trying to help him out, and, like, him kind of talking about all the scars on his body and this and that. Like, I feel like you get more to do with him in that movie than you did with Nightcrawler in Apocalypse.
Oh, okay. It's again, I don't think I'm being a nitpicker because Infinity War and Endgame have shown us how to balance a large ensemble cast. Like,
absolutely,
you give characters moments to shine, and you kind of balance these different storylines and bring them together. Mm-hmm. So it's not like I'm asking for something impossible here. We know it's been done, and arguably it's been done in other X-Men movies. Like there's been other X-Men films that have carried multiple characters forward as a result of their experiences in the story. Here, a lot of them are just there, which again is not. It's not just annoying. It's lazy. It's unrefined. It's not something that you should be doing in your 12th film. Like you should have this figured out by now.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are huge Phoenix Saga fans in the comics, no, they don't do it right again. Mm-hmm. And Simon Kinberg gave this very lazy explanation. Someone asked him about, are you going to include this element from the story or this one from the comics? Yep. And he's like, well, I want to include all those elements, but it would be a 5-hour movie. Mm-hmm. To his credit, yes, like the original Phoenix Saga, as it played out in the comics, went over a number of years. Yep. So you had Jean introduced as the Phoenix, and then she was just part of the X-Men as Phoenix for a number of years. Yep. And then there was like kind of like a turning point, and then there was the stuff with the Dark Phoenix. So he's absolutely right. There's no way they could do all of that in one movie. But I feel like they could have done more of the original X-Men Phoenix storyline than what they've chosen to do with Dark Phoenix, because they really don't go much farther into it than they did in X-Men 3.
Yeah, so a common complaint I have with a lot of movies is that movies that tend to push past 2 hours and be like 2 hours and 10 minutes, 2 hours and 20 minutes, excuse me, I always find that they can be a bit shorter. I always think, like, you know what, you probably could have cut 10, 15 minutes off and it would have been fine. This movie is actually one of the rare cases where I wish it was about 15, 20 minutes longer, because the movie is less than 2 hours, credits included. So you could have made it 10 or 15 minutes longer. The movie would have been about 2 hours and 10 minutes. And some of the X-Men movies are around that length, right? Logan is 2 hours and 20 minutes. Days of Future Past is 131 minutes. So for the sake of having a bit more explanation and a bit more time to give characters a bit more to do, I would have been perfectly fine if they extended it just a little bit longer so we could get more of a glimpse into what was going on and less of a, I'm here. All right, checklist. Good. All right, let's move on to the next action set piece, right?
All right, let's just get into spoilers now.
All
so
right.
If you have not seen Dark Phoenix, there will be a time code in the description where you can skip ahead to avoid any spoilers, because there are things in here that are, spoilery to the plot.
Yeah.
Even if you have seen the trailer, there's still things that you'll be spoiled for. So we're going to go into the spoilerverse now, where it's okay to talk about spoilers for anything.
Yeah, for anything.
But specifically for Dark Phoenix.
That's
so
right.
Getting into it, I'm so happy Mystique died. I mean, the trailer really broadcasted that she was going to, kick the bucket. Mm. But when it actually happened, I was like, you're supposed to feel sad in that moment. Right, you're supposed to feel sad because it's like there's this character who's been a part of all these people's lives, and I'm like, yes, because I'm like, fake Mystique. I'm glad you're gone. Like, I know that's not the reaction I was supposed to have in the moment, but I was just so sick and tired of this.
Something.
And I found a lot of the moments with Jennifer Lawrence in the movie, like Dark Phoenix, she was just patronizing Charles Xavier and like ripping on him.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, take that.
Yeah, I think when she, well, for one, her actual death scene I didn't feel anything. And like I felt more for the characters that were affected by it, like like the whole funeral scene afterwards and the way Beast reacts. I felt more for him. I felt more for Charles Xavier. But yeah, for Mystique specifically, it was kind of the same thing in Rogue One, where like these characters that you didn't know that well dying. Like I wanted to feel something, but I was like, they died, moving on. And I kind of felt that way with Mystique. I didn't feel sad. I wish I felt a little more sad, but like you say, Mystique in the Jennifer Lawrence's Mystique in these last few movies has been passable at best. So
she didn't even use her powers. All she did was change into regular Jennifer Lawrence.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, let me use my powers to turn myself into my quote unquote true self. So no, I agree. I didn't feel that much for that either.
If I were to imagine that she was like playing some other character, like that character of Raven, the X-Men team leader, who cares about her people and she's questioning Charles's behavior, I'm like, that's a great character, original character, but like I'm gonna pretend she's not Mystique because that's not what Mystique is at all.
Yeah.
So
I have an interesting thought about the movie that obviously deals with spoilers, and that is, for all of X-Men The Last Stand's faults, I think one of the things that The Last Stand got right was that even though it seems to me, even though Dark Phoenix is one of the antagonists in The Last Stand, Magneto is obviously once again another antagonist. And it helps because Magneto is a guy who we got to know very well in the first X-Men movie. Then we got to know even better in the second X-Men movie. Then X-Men The Last Stand comes along, and you don't need a half an hour with all these different scenes to explain Magneto's motivations, because a lot of them are already properly set up in the earlier movies. So by the time you get to The Last Stand, it makes sense that he'd want Dark Phoenix on his side. It would make sense that he'd want to fight against the Cure and lead that rebellion, if you will. Whereas in Dark Phoenix, the aliens, that's the big sci-fi element I find that Simon Kinberg brought to this movie, that like brought it a step forward and further in regards to sci-fi elements. And then the fact that like, Jessica Chastain's character, she's kind of in the way the other antagonists. Like you have the Dark Phoenix, but then even then when she tries to transfer her powers to Jessica Chastain's character, it's almost like, right, they're doing that thing where it's like, here's the antagonist. We fight against the antagonist. But, well, no, guys. In the third act, you're going to find out who the real antagonist is, and it's Jessica Chastain. I felt like by the end of the movie, I don't think they did enough to properly explain the aliens, their backstory, like, what happened to their planet, more about Jessica Chastain's character. It seems like they tried. There are a few scenes, but, I mean, heck, even a movie like Captain Marvel, which I thought, sorry, once again was like a very decent movie, not amazing. I felt like it actually did more to kind of set up the alien struggle that was going on between the two races. And even then, that wasn't like, I still wanted more, but I felt like that did more than this movie did. By the end of it, I was still wondering a lot about, like, I need more from the villain, and I need more about these aliens that they dropped into one movie. And they're like, okay, okay, here are the basic things you need to know, and then let's just move forward with the action set pieces. But by the end, I was like, I want more. Like, I don't think that was enough.
The alien, like, we don't even know any of their names. We don't know what planet they're from, their race. Like, there's all kinds of Marvel alien races that they could have used. And you know what? There is a science fiction element to the Phoenix story in the comics.
Right.
Because there are these alien races that sort of come after Jean Grey saying, like, we want the Phoenix.
Right.
And at one point, when Jean is possessed by the Phoenix, she blows up a planet and kills 5 billion people.
Wow, yeah.
And then these alien races basically abduct her, and they say, like, you're going to be put on trial for these things that you did.
Yeah.
And that brings the X-Men into space. So it's this really cool sci-fi story, something we haven't seen before in an X-Men film.
Yeah.
They should have done that, but no, they did the exact same thing in X-Men 3, tying the story of the Phoenix into her childhood and something Xavier did when he was younger. And it's just like, why are you... We did that, and no one liked it. Why did you go and do that again? And the fact that they kind of went halfway there, it's like, okay, because they can't call it the Phoenix Force because that's too comic booky,
right?
So it's just, there's this force, and it's like, just call it the Phoenix Force already. Yeah. This franchise is still living in this world where they're afraid to embrace the names and the conventions of the comic book storytelling that it's based on.
Which is funny when you think about it, and you think about like how far comic books have come, and the fact that when you think about like all the characters and like the social commentary and the politics and like the jokes about the yellow spandex, but then of course like the characters, like the costumes that they're wearing are like the blue and yellow, and like it's funny that you feel like on the one hand they have embraced the X-Men in their world and whatnot, but then there's still things like that where they're like, maybe that's too far. And it's like, you guys are fine, right? Like, we like the X-Men. You guys can go crazy, and we'll still want to see
they don't even
the
do
movie.
that right, because Apocalypse teases at the end they're all going to get costumes similar to their comic book counterparts.
Yeah.
And then, boop, come to this movie, they're all wearing the exact same thing. And it's like...
Yeah,
like,
they changed it
like
up.
those suits are based on one run of X-Men comics.
Right.
But it's like, we've seen them wear matching uniforms. Like, give them their individualized uniforms. That's what part of what makes X-Men special, is the fact they all dress a little differently.
Yeah.
And they teased us with it in Apocalypse, and then they just poof.
Decided against it.
So they don't lean into the actual Phoenix Saga story in the comics. They kind of like half-ass it by having the Phoenix Force comes from space this time.
Yeah.
And there are aliens invested in the Phoenix Force. Those are like the two new elements that were not part of the story originally that were put in this new film.
Yes.
So it's a step in the right direction, but it's like not nearly enough steps in the right direction.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the timeline, holy moly. So like they say that Jean was 8 years old in 1975 because they flash back to 1975 to when this accident with her parents.
Yeah.
X-Men Apocalypse is set in 1983, and she's Sophie Turner.
Yep.
So are you telling me that 16-year-old, does that make sense? 16-year-old Jean Grey was Sophie Turner?
Yeah, well, see, if she was 8 years old in 1975, that means she'd be born in 1967. So, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But then, okay, wait. But then this is 1992.
Yeah.
So that means that she would be 25.
Yeah.
In 1992.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
She looks the same, right? I mean, sometimes, like, movies struggle with trying to make young actors look older. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes it's like, they look the same. It doesn't look like much has changed.
Like, do we believe that Ty Sheridan as Cyclops is 9 years older than he was in X-Men Apocalypse? Or that Alexandra's ship as Storm is 9 years older?
No, they all look the same. I mean, it's 3 years. Well, actually, no, even less, because technically if they're going to release the movie in late 2018, that means, filming would have been around 2 years. Like, the filming of Apocalypse would have been 2 years before the filming of Dark Phoenix. So, yeah, they all basically look the same.
And they in Apocalypse, they kind of suggested that there is a Phoenix Force inside of her, and that comes out during the big final fight with Apocalypse.
That's right, yeah.
That is entirely it's like that was literally the last movie you made.
Yeah.
Like, people whined in First Class when you find out that Beast built Cerebro, because there's there's a throwaway line of dialogue in the first movie where Xavier says, Magneto and I built Cerebro.
Right.
That's like a throwaway line.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that 10 years later when they're writing First Class, they would have forgotten about that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a continuity error, sure, but it's a small thing. This, with the Phoenix, it's literally, it was in the last movie you wrote.
Yeah.
And it was a major element of that film's finale. So
Yeah.
it's like, how do you...
Well, it's like I said earlier, film is changing all the time. I like when films are faithful to, things that they set up in earlier films, but I bet you anything that they decided at the time that was a good idea, and then during production and pre-production, as they were talking, they're like, yeah, maybe we should change that, and then they do.
So in this film, the president decides to stop being friendly to the X-Men because of what the Phoenix is doing.
Yeah.
This is a world where Apocalypse happened, everything with Magneto and the 70s happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a result of mutants. Why is it this little incident where she kills one person and injures a couple people
a good point.
Is the straw that breaks the camel back? Because it suggests at the start of the film that they've been building goodwill for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Why is all of a sudden this random event is what severs that relationship?
Because it's convenient to the story. That's probably why, right? Yeah, and that's another difficult thing, especially with franchise movies, right, is that sometimes you set something up, or even, people have actually made strong cases about the fact that, as awesome as Civil War is, they're like, well, Civil War, they have these big stakes, right? It's like, well, now there's a Superhero Registration Act. But then, of course, it's like, oh, it's touched upon briefly at the beginning of Infinity War, but we don't have any time to deal with that. Let's move forward, right? Sometimes you establish things in earlier movies that, depending on what you want to do in the next movie, it can be hard to kind of follow through with that. That doesn't mean they're justified in all the time in changing things. But yes, I guess that I get that it's frustrating that you're like, okay, this is cool, this is set up, so what's going to happen for the next movie? And they're like, nothing. We're moving forward. It's like, okay.
The finale of this film apparently was originally going to be set in space, and that's why they reshot it, because they figured it was going to be too close to Captain Marvel in terms of being too similar.
Yeah, I guess so.
When I was watching the film, it didn't feel like reshoots. Like it just felt like the movie was continuing. So
I like the train scene. Like honestly, if I had to pick like a highlighted scene that made me feel something, like that moment where now it's very cliched. The whole like, oh, let us help you. You just have to, get us out of these restraints. And they're like, no, we'll take care of it. And all the soldiers get demolished and whatnot. When they all get their restraints released and they all like stand up together and kind of look at the foes that are coming into the train. That was kind of like a moment where I was just like, yeah, that's cool. That was one of the few moments that like I liked of the movie. I was like, okay,
because they're actually using their powers.
That's right, and it's the age old cliche of like the heroes and villains, they don't get along. They fight and this and that, but once in a while they have to put aside their differences and join forces as the X-Men. So I thought that was cool.
Genosha's in this movie, but they don't call it Genosha because can't use the names of things from the comic books.
So which one is that?
Genosha is the island where Magneto lives.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Except
yeah.
in the comics, it's this big sprawling city with giant buildings and whatnot.
Yep.
Here, it's like this like weird little commune thing.
Yeah, it's a little village. Which I thought was cool. I like that idea. I thought that was really cool that Magneto, instead of, being like a stereotypical villain and going out and doing bad guy things, he was just trying to exist with other mutants and other people.
We saw the same thing in Apocalypse. He retired. Like, how many times this guy had to come out of retirement? It's like,
that's right. Yeah, this is a second retirement.
Okay, I feel like I'm bashing this poor animal, so I'm gonna say some nice things.
Please do.
There's a cameo by a famous X-Men character called Dazzler during that party. So there's that.
Oh, was that the one that was kind of doing the whole perform? Oh, yeah. I was wondering. I was like, who is this?
Yeah. So she's a character named Dazzler, and her power is that she can basically make lights come up like that.
Good for entertainment.
Yeah. So she's like a pop star in the Marvel universe. And
that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So that was a fun cameo.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, I can't help but feel like this because now that I know that the train scene was reshoots.
Yeah.
They're on the train, and all these security guys, they're part of the mutant control unit.
Right.
And on all their shirts, it says MCU.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was like, that's so funny.
So I'm like, is this like some kind of meta commentary on the fact that, like, with the new world orders, that basically the MCU is holding the X-Men hostage, and they're like, let us help, let us do something. Like, no, you stay there, we'll do this.
Imagine if it said something different earlier on, and in post-production, they're like, yeah, let's change that to MCU just to make this clear to people where they're going.
Granted, like, the mutant control unit is a thing from like the comics and other movies, so it's not like but there is a symbolic nature to that. It's like that this movie and this whole franchise is basically like held up by the fact that it's all of a sudden there's way less interest in it because it is like the closing chapter of a storyline that will not be continued because the X-Men rights are now back with the MCU.
Yeah.
Professor Xavier, though, so I feel like the writing failed him in this film because I wasn't sure how I was supposed to feel about him.
Yeah.
Because the first kind of half of the movie, Mystique and Beast really like rip into him and say like, these are things you did wrong. But then you kind of find out it's like, oh, like it wasn't all bad with his decisions. Like the reason he wiped her memory to like save her of dealing with her father. And I was like, I was actually really interested in like seeing like a morally ambiguous or like not, or kind of like not a bad Professor Xavier, but one wherein his decision making is flawed.
Exactly. Yeah,
and they kind of write it. It's like, oh no, actually he was doing something nice. Mm-hmm. And initially he's like, I thought it was interesting how he was like refusing to like apologize. He was like, no, like I stand in what but then he caves anyway and apologizes.
Of course, yeah, it'll set up the arc. I thought that was a cool setup. I liked the fact that, and it makes sense that with these characters that there's always some sort of opposition, right? There's always going to be some sort of problem, right? It's like, like, oh, they work together and they've done so much for like the mutant movement, if you will. But that I kind of like at the beginning how Mystique is kind of ticked off with Professor X. And like he even makes the case where he's like, like after everything we've gone through, what we're doing now is good. Because like that was kind of one callback, like you think about the earlier X-Men movies and you think about how mutants are normally treated and whatnot. So I think it was a good setup. And yes, like you say, I feel like by the end they just, make it very clear that it's like, no, I was wrong, I'm sorry, and this and that. But I think it makes sense, especially at this point for some of the characters to not be, it's the whole thing that sometimes you have leaders in movies that, like make all the right decisions and they're good leaders and the people below them are like, yes, we like our leaders. But I like when they actually have a problem with them and they're like, think about all you've done, all the risks that you've put us through and whatnot. Like we're risking ourselves to save these people. But of course, Professor X is so strong about it that like I think it was a good way to kind of I don't know, to kind of get into the story. And of course it sets up the fact that, that the Dark Phoenix incident happens. And then of course the president is like, nope, sorry, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And Professor X is like, everything we've worked for. Yeah.
I'm just angry now.
Yeah.
I thought this was going to be therapeutic for me to like talk it out and, figure out how I really feel about this.
Right.
But all it's done is really just exacerbate my frustrations. Like even Nightcrawler, like he's just in the movie. He doesn't really have a character arc at all. And you get like an inkling that he's like off put by all the violence.
Right.
But then there's just a moment where he just like snaps and starts killing people.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is going on?
I found that interesting. Geez, where he teleports the one girl that he's been fighting against and puts her on the railroad tracks. You see the train come by and just take her out. I was like, they should have called this movie Dark Phoenix and also Dark Nightcrawler. We see him go to the dark side as well. Well, here's one thing I kind of thought about as well, which once again kind of made me think about this comparison of X-Men: The Last Stand compared to Dark Phoenix. Remind me, Average Joe, because you might have a better memory than I do, but the whole Scott Summers and Jean Grey relationship, do we get that at all in X-Men Apocalypse?
A little bit, because they meet for the first time.
Right, so we get like an implication that like, oh, there might be sparks here.
Yeah.
So it seemed to me that one thing that Last Stand did well was that, once again, in X-Men 1 and 2, there's at least, I feel like, just a little bit more established that Scott and Jean Grey are an item, right? Like there's that line that Scott says to Logan in the first one where he says something like, keep your hands off of my girl or something like that, right? Very much like, he kind of like, that's my girl, don't mess with me or I'll, like there's a bit of a love triangle, if you will, right? So you kind of get a more of a sense, even though it might not be completely drawn out, you get a bit more of a sense that Scott and Jean are a thing and that Logan has feelings for Jean, so therefore it becomes a love triangle, and we see how Scott is very not a huge fan of Logan. Yet in this movie, it just seemed to me that in the beginning, of course, they have that scene between Scott and Jean where Jean is like, I feel amazing. And it almost felt like, hey guys, remember they're an item, right? And it's like, well, we've seen that before with the other characters, but now it seems like you're really trying to shoehorn that in instead of trying to find a way to either give it more time in this movie or set it up in an earlier movie, because there's a line towards the end where Scott's getting really angry and Magneto and Beast are going to go to take out try and take out Dark Phoenix, and then Scott is like, if you do anything, I'll effing kill you, and it didn't feel earned.
I laughed.
Yeah, a lot of people found that very funny, and for me, I was just like, that didn't feel earned because I don't think we've done enough to kind of establish their relationship in this movie.
He was trying to sound tough. And it didn't work.
Yeah, I feel like, what's a good example? But I don't know, if you had more of a relationship with them to kind of set up the stakes of what happens with Dark Phoenix and him and all that, I felt like that line could have had more weight to it. But really, you had, here's a checklist of all the things we need to show, briefly this, that, out all the ingredients into a bowl. Oh, and Scott gets really angry in one scene. It's like, it's not enough. I need a bit more. I need moments like that to be earned and not just thrown out and being like, oh, snap, he's angry, right? Like, you need a bit more setup for a moment like that, for him to be angry in general to work, I found.
So coming around to final thoughts, while I was able to enjoy myself watching in the theater, which is actually how I felt with X-Men Apocalypse as well. While I was watching, I enjoyed it. But it's one of those movies that just leaves a bad aftertaste in your mouth. The more you think about it, it continues a lot of the flaws of the previous X-Men films. Compared to other superhero films, it does things poorly that if they learned from their peers, they should know how to do better.
Yeah.
It's the second time they've tried to adapt the same story, and they've failed for the second time. Mm-hmm. Giving it's a better... The Dark Phoenix part of this is better than the Dark Phoenix part of The Last Stand. Mm-hmm. But overall, I think I might, just as an entertaining movie, as crazy as it might sound, I think The Last Stand might be the more entertaining movie.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, I'm going to give this 2.4 out of 4 bad cookies.
I give the movie a 6 out of 10 on IMDb because that's how I rate all my movies. I would say at the end of the day, there are some problems with the story and characters, such as things just being rushed, not being properly explained. And then by the end, of course, they want you to feel for these characters. But at the end of the day, it just seems to me that maybe the focus wasn't all in the right places that it should have been. And there are a lot of things lacking for me. And the movie just felt very standard to me. I like the performances. I like the train scene. The movie thank goodness, was not boring. At the very least, it was entertaining to watch, and I liked the setup. But yeah, by the end of the movie, it just feels a little underwhelming, and you're like, I wish I felt a bit more at the end of a movie like this. And it has a great ending scene that does feel like a good cap to the end of the X-Men prequel movies. Yet all the other movie, you can't just forget that. You're like, that wasn't great either. So it leaves me with just it was a fine kind of feeling.
Yeah. So really, this is not the ending to the Fox X-Men movies that you'd want. You really, having seen it, I can say they shouldn't have released this. They should have just coughed. I mean, it cost a lot to make.
Yeah.
But I think it would have been in the interest of Fox and Disney to have not put this out there and just start over fresh with introducing the X-Men somehow into the MCU a few years from now, because this is certainly not the. I doubt the Phoenix will rise from this.
Yeah, that's true.
Normally we'd go into the bat jar and look at our mail, but we don't have any.
If you want to contact the show with a question or idea for an episode, or just sending us some fan mail, be like, hey, I'm a fan. You can send us an email to
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet at us with the Twitter birds.
At the Bat Cookie Jar.
Yeah. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, YouTube, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, SoundCloud, right next to all the rappers, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can share our post on the Book of Faces. Oh, no, that's very different. That's something else.
Facebook is quite literally a book of all the faces of people you know.
Yeah, that's true. That's not too bad. And
that doesn't sound creepy, does it?
No. This is my Facebook. I like them all. And make sure to like our page, because it'll show up and be like, so-and-so like this. And you're like, what the heck is this? And then you stumble across all our crazy episodes. Just because we want everyone to join us inside the Bat Jar. We really need some renovations done. So if you're good at renovating, we might put you to work inside the cookie jar.
So this is normally when we would go into the Bat Jar to find a topic for next week, but thankfully a new movie is coming out that will hopefully help me forget my experience of Dark Phoenix, because we have the new Men in Black International. I just get my hands on one of those neuralizers.
Yeah, that's right.
We should thank Ben the Movie Buff for coming back this week and for bringing his insights and his perspective to the film. So thank you, Ben, for joining us.
No worries. Thank you for having me. This is always a blast.
Come back to the Bat Jar podcast next week when we talk about Men in Black. Maybe we'll talk about the old movies before International. I don't know, but it'll be Men in Black themed. So get your sunglasses and your neuralizers, because we're going to be talking about Men in Black next week. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Ben the Movie Buff.
Catch you on the flip side.
See you later.